The trial motif in John's Gospel. In this lecture, I'd like to look at the first two chapters of a book by Andrew Lincoln called Truth on Trial. It was published in 2000, and it looks at the lawsuit motif in the fourth Gospel. I'd like to rearrange his chapters a little bit and topics a little bit for my own presentation of this. So I'm going to begin with his discussion of Isaiah 40 through 55 as the background for John's lawsuit motif, because it's in this section of Isaiah that we have a lawsuit motif as well. The motif is that God has a controversy with the people and brings a lawsuit against them. This is something that we find elsewhere in Scripture, as in Deuteronomy 32, Hosea 4 and 5, also in Hosea chapter 12, verses 2 to 14, and in Micah chapter 6, 1 through 8. But in this section of Isaiah, the lawsuit motif dominates. It's especially to be seen in chapter 42, 18 through 25, 43, 22 to 28, and 50, 1 through 3. But that's not the only section of these chapters in Isaiah that's relevant. The trial speech of Yahweh is also present here. Isaiah 41, 1 through 5, 21 through 23, chapter 43, 8 through 13, chapter 44, 6 through 8, and chapter 45, 18 through 25. And then there are disputations in chapter 40, 12 through 31, 44, 24 through 28, 45, 9 through 13, 46, 5 through 11, 48, 1 through 15, and 48, 14 through 26, and finally 55, 8 through 13. So we have this motif that's elsewhere in Scripture now dominating these chapters in Isaiah with the lawsuit, the trial speech of Yahweh, and disputations. What Lincoln points out is that in this section of Isaiah, there are two types of lawsuit. One is against the nations, or you could say the gods of the nations. Yahweh is the only God. And then secondly, there is the disputation that Israel has against God. And what we see is that John picks up on both of these types of lawsuits and brings them together. The first type of lawsuit in John is expanded around the story of Jesus. Israel represents the nations in John's gospel, and Jesus represents God in this trial motif. Jesus is the authorized agent of God, the chief witness and the judge, and then these judicial roles are combined with that role of the servant that we also find in Isaiah 40 to 55, beginning in chapter 42. And then secondly, there's this trial of Israel against God, and so in John's gospel we see that there is a prosecution of Jesus that is taking place, particularly by the Jews. Ultimately, Pilate plays a role in that as well, of course, that leads to Jesus' crucifixion. So there are two types of trials going on. One is the trial that God brings against Israel through Jesus, and therefore to the world. And then the other is this historical motif of Jesus on trial in Israel and ultimately being crucified. This is typical of Johannine irony, but also the historical story of Jesus. Now, Lincoln talks about themes in Isaiah 40 through 55 that are related to themes in the Gospel of John. And I won't be bringing out those sections where he talks about the Gospel of John. Just note that each of these are significant aspects of the Gospel of John. Here I'd like to point out where they are in Isaiah 40 to 55. So we have, first of all, obviously, forensic language, law court language of judgment or to judge. And then secondly, there is very interestingly in the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, the language that God uses of himself, I am. He speaks of himself as the I am. And we find this in Isaiah 41:4, 43:10 and 25, 45:18, twice in 46:4, and then in 48:12 and 51:12. Then there's also the language of glory, and this is a significant language in John's Gospel. He says, Lincoln says, then the glory of the Lord, Isaiah 40 verse 5 in the Septuagint says, as Lincoln quotes it, then the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see the salvation of God. The revealing of the glory of God is associated with Jesus' ministry and in particular his death on the cross in John's Gospel. God gives his glory to no other, we read in Isaiah 42, 48, and other passages are related to that. And then God will be glorified in Israel and in his servant as well. And this too is true of John's Gospel, that God's glory is revealed through Jesus, the servant of God. And the servant, we read in the Septuagint of Isaiah 52 verse 13, will be lifted up and will be glorified. And all of this language is used in John's Gospel of Jesus. He is the I am. He is the one to be lifted up in the double meaning of glorified and also of crucified. And in fact, it is the moment of his crucifixion that is the ultimate revelation of God's glory in John's Gospel. There's also the language of light in John, and we find this too in Isaiah 40 through 55. God's servant will be a light to the nations, we read in chapters 42 and 49. And then Yahweh's judgment and salvation will be a light to the nations. Then there's also related language of the opposite, of those who are blind or in darkness. And in addition, we find the language of water. Water is very significant in John's Gospel. And living water as well in chapter 4, you may remember, with the Samaritan woman. But water appears a number of times in John's Gospel, and here also in this section of Isaiah. Isaiah 48:21, water will gush from the rock, reflecting the occurrence of the water in the wilderness as the children of Israel are led through the Sinai to the promised land. Then there's water in the wilderness as an image of restoration, where there will be rivers in the desert and drink for the chosen people. We find this in chapter 43, verse 20, especially, and other related passages. God is also shepherd in this section of Isaiah. God is the shepherd who feeds his flock. He carries the lambs, and he gently leads or comforts the mother sheep. And no one can snatch his sheep out of the hands of Yahweh. And then there are the quotes from this section of Isaiah that are also in John. 3 times John quotes from this section. He quotes 40 verse 3 in 123. This is in respect to John the Baptist. 53:1 in 1238 and 54:13 in John 6:45. Direct quotes will lead us to the section of Isaiah just as much as the themes will that we've just identified here. Now let's look at the trial motif in John's Gospel with several points. And some can be said quite quickly. Obviously, Jesus is the plaintiff. Jesus is on trial, but we did already say that there's this double trial going on, where Jesus is also bringing judgment to Israel and to the world by his coming from heaven. There are also witnesses, and various witnesses are brought forward at different points, and sometimes their witness is brought up at different points in John's Gospel. So we find this in the person of John the Baptist, the first witness who is introduced. He's even introduced in the prologue of John's Gospel. So in John chapter 1, several times, and then after the prologue from 1:19, several times, then in chapter 3 as well. And then Jesus declares in chapter 5, verse 33, that John the Baptist's testimony was true. Jesus himself is a witness. Now, he plays various roles in the trial, but one of those roles is as witness. Also, Jesus' works are a witness in the trial. God is a witness. The scriptures are said to be a witness. The Samaritan woman is a witness to other Samaritans. And then the crowd bears witness that Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead in chapter 12, verse 17. There's also a jury, and various characters throughout the story are called upon to make a decision about Jesus' witness, or the witness that is about Jesus as the one who comes from the Father, the one who comes from heaven. So the jury is made up out of various characters at various points throughout the story. The charges Lincoln lists are as follows. First of all, the charge is that Jesus is a false prophet. No prophet can come from Nazareth, and you come from there. Secondly, Jesus violates the Sabbath laws and is therefore a sinner. Thirdly, Jesus is said to be a blasphemer, making himself equal to God. And fourthly, Jesus is said to be an enemy of the Jewish nation. There is also testimony at the trial. Jesus' final mission statement is as follows in chapter 18, verse 37. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. We might have even listed truth as a part of the trial motif, because there's a lot said about truth in John's Gospel. But there are other mission statements as well. Why did Jesus come into the world? Chapter 5, 22, 27, 30, chapter 6, 38, chapter 9, 39, chapter 10, verse 10, and then in chapter 12, 46 through 47. All of these appear in the public ministry of Jesus, whereas the passage in 1837 appears after Jesus' upper room discourse with his disciples at the public trial. Then there is the issue of a judge at a trial. And I mentioned earlier that Jesus plays different roles in the trial, and one of the other roles he plays is as judge. Jesus is judge. A number of times, the judge can give life on the one hand, as we see in chapter 3, 17 through 19, or the judge can pronounce judgment, as we see in chapter 5 a couple times, a couple passages, in chapter 12. Now, the Sanhedrin also is a court of judgment, and so the Sanhedrin plays a role as judge as well in John's Gospel. In 11:47 through 53, before the actual trial of Jesus, the Sanhedrin has already come to its condemnation of Jesus, that he should suffer death. But the Jewish leaders are also on trial, and they have done certain things that deserve judgment. They, first of all, choose Barabbas, and then they say, at the Passover of all times, says Lincoln, they say that they have no king but Caesar. This is a time where they should emphasize that they serve no one but God, reflecting on the message of the Passover. But in fact, they claim they have no king but Caesar. And then Pilate is also involved in a odd way as a judge, but also as one who doesn't want to judge and ultimately does judge. And he brings charges against Jesus for Jesus being King of the Jews, being the royal Messiah, and being the Son of God. So Pilate passes judgment, but he is also on trial in his verdict against Jesus. The disciples have a role to play as well. They are witnesses. The narrator is the chief witness. He's telling a true testimony. We learn in chapter 19, verse 35. And then the disciples are told by Jesus that they will be hated by the world and expelled from the synagogue in their role as witnesses. That's especially in that section of the Upper Room Discourse in 15:18 through 16:15. The disciples will be witnesses, Jesus says in verse 27 of chapter 15. And then we have the case of Peter. Peter is a disciple who has failed in his witness during the trial of Jesus. And yet this failure of his as witness is undone in the epilogue in chapter 21, where he has his threefold affirmation of love for Jesus. Now, in addition to this, we have an advocate who supports the defendants, the disciples. And Jesus says that after he goes, he will give the Spirit to play this role for the disciple witnesses. He will then support them in their testimony in chapter 14:26 and 16:13 and 14. An advocate, though, can also be involved in the prosecution, and he functions as a prosecutor. Those who were wrong about Jesus and also wrong about sin, righteousness, and judgment. So the Spirit plays this role of prosecution. In conclusion, then, we've seen the importance of the trial motif in John's Gospel. And we've also noted how John picks up on Isaiah 40 to 55 with this motif. And so as we look at various parts of John's Gospel, we can note the trial motif in its various forms, and then also the connection with verses and themes from that section of Isaiah. But I'd like to conclude with a word from Richard Bauckham in his 2015 book, Gospel of Glory, Major Themes in Johannine Theology. And on page 74 and page 75, he points to the fact that we move beyond just a trial motif to an understanding of Jesus as the truth in John's Gospel. And I want to read several parts of the last couple paragraphs of this chapter 4 on pages 74 to 75. So I'll begin with this. One way in which truth illuminates John's understanding of Jesus' death and resurrection exaltation is therefore the manifold way in which in death and resurrection Jesus fulfills Scripture. He is, for example, the true Passover lamb, slain to effect the new exodus from the empire of sin. He is the true temple of the Messianic age, from which the water of life flows. He is the true righteous king of the Psalms of David, protected by God even in his abandonment to deathly affliction. He is the truth of Jacob's ladder, raised up on the cross to reach heaven. By fulfilling Scripture in these and many other ways, Jesus enacts God's faithfulness. In him, God proves true to his word. When the prologue speaks of the incarnate one as full of grace and truth, chapter 1, verse 14, it echoes the character description of God as abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness from Exodus 34, verse 6. And skipping a bit down to the next paragraph on page 75, the frequent use of truth and true in John's Gospel is not often explicitly related to Jesus' death. During his interrogation by Pilate, Jesus says, "For this was I born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth." Chapter 18, verse 37. This relates to the overarching theme of a cosmic trial that unites the language of witness and judgment throughout the gospel. And there he references the book Truth on Trial by Andrew Lincoln. And then he adds, "But the gospel does not seem to portray Jesus' death itself as a form of witness." And then he says, "More relevant to our topic is Jesus' claim actually to be the truth. I am the way and the truth and the life," says Jesus in 14, verse 6. In context, in chapter 14, the way is the way to his Father's house, the way that Jesus is about to go, so that he can later return and take his disciples to the place he will have prepared for them there. This is the way Jesus takes when he goes to his death and exaltation. Thus it is Jesus crucified and exalted who is the way, just as it is Jesus crucified and exalted who is the ladder reaching from earth to heaven, seen in Jacob's dream in John 1:51. Similarly, it is as the crucified and risen one that Jesus is the life, and so it would seem that this must also be the sense in which he is the truth. In his death and resurrection exaltation, he incarnates the true character of God and the true way for humans to come to God.